Next up is Valentin. Good to go.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here, learning all these things. I always say this, every time we come, we learn a lot of new things in just 1 year. Well, this was 2 or 3, but still, it's always new, and how fast this is moving. My role today is to talk about polycultures, to talk about the intercropping work that has been done by a lot of people. And what is it we have to trust? Wait. There you go. We all love Kernza, and one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that Kernza, it's a perennial grain crop, but it's a perennial dual use crop at the same time. We want, it's not just that we can harvest it for forage, but it's another of the ecosystem services and the benefits having the forage. And that leads us to how or why do we need the intercropping? Why do we wanna do research on intercropping? Isn't it faster, and it's gonna get us faster and to our goal of increasing yields to just grow it in a monoculture and do all the research on that? Well, we started with this image of the prairie and the inspiration of the diverse systems, but we also are here not to only harvest grain and food, but also to provide a lot of ecosystem services. And the diversity in the ecosystem is what really brings all these other ecosystem services. So we have to keep that in mind. We need this diverse perennial circular systems. And one of the things I learned here probably many years ago was the importance of diversity to promote a series of benefits of ecosystem functions. And we used to talk about how more diverse systems would bring more sustainability or stability. How do we get the pointer here? Well, on the screen you have there a study we did using data from a long-term cropping system study in Wisconsin, where we compare different crop rotations with different level of perenniality, from all the way to modern continuous corn to corn soybean with 2 or 3 years of alfalfa. And we found that the more perenniality in the system, the more stability of production over time. And we also look at the same crop rotations, but in a diversity gradient, number of species in the crop rotation from 1 to 5 or 6. And we found that the more diversity, the more resilience to drought. So the yields in a year of drought were higher when we had more diversity. So in a way, that's more experimental evidence, and that's been shown in other type of studies. Okay. To document that we need those two things. We need perenniality, we need diversity, and we can put these two axes of perenniality and diversity and plot the different cropping systems that we can have in a farm, from all the way from annual monocultures to our perennial grasslands or prairies. And somewhere along that gradient, it's where we have the more, with more diversity and more perenniality, where we have more ecosystem services. And that's what we think it's a path of ecological intensification. And that's why we really want to have diversity in the system. That's why we want polycultures, or at least intercrops in Kernza. So just to mention this, we put that in a review we recently published, and just to show you Priscilla Pinto, our postdoc in Wisconsin. She's great at making figures. You already saw several of them in different presentations. The logic of having these dual use perennial crops, the 2.5 there, that it's gonna give us the roots below ground, the forage, and the grain above ground. It's a very important system that we're trying to promote. So what have we learned from past studies on intercropping? And I think we're due for a good review, but I just quickly look at studies from all the way from Peggy Wagner in '89 on Rodale Institute, going to my PhD work and work that's been done in Australia, and well, Nicole's work on intercropping in Minnesota, the work that Eugene and the group from Cornell have done, also our folks from Manitoba, of course, team here in Kansas, the people in Sweden, and then some work we've done in Wisconsin. Always the effect of the adding a legume or adding another species, it's going from negative to zero. In some cases, it's positive in terms of yield. In many cases, there's no effect. But what I think the main thing we have to remember is that this is not just about grain yield, it's about all the other benefits that intercrops have. And so I'm gonna make a reflection at the end about like, what do we expect and how do we assess the intercropping experiments? So real quickly from Peggy Wagner's work, people have been trying intercropping with white clover, with barefoot trefoil, crimson clover in different configurations. In Germany, they tried wheatgrass with a different of other crops, lupin and linseed and rye and clover. And in my PhD, I look at Kernza, well, it wasn't Kernza at that point, intermediate wheatgrass with white clover, alfalfa, and Illinois bandelflower. And we found some examples where we would get positive effects and some examples where we would get zero or negative effects in the seed yield. Australia, Canada, in all the cases, or in most cases, it's a similar thing. There's not a lot of gain or even some competition from the legumes or from the other intercrop in the yield. Now, most of these studies are 2-year studies, short-term. Nicole's work with 5 in Minnesota. The first there is the biculture with the legume, and then you have the monoculture and the fertilized monoculture. Some cases you see similar yields, some cases you see lower yields with legume, except when you get to the 4th year, where you start seeing some benefit of the legume, but in a context of still yield reduction. So New York, similar thing, not effect of the red clover or some competition from the red clover. This, I assume you're going to be talking later on this, but we know, team found a positive effect after the 5th year of the intercropping. In Sweden, a similar thing after 3 years, the intercrop with alfalfa got similar yields than the monoculture, and these were fertilized intercrops. So we found in Wisconsin a similar thing. When we put red clover, we get lower grain yield. We do have much more forage production, and we do have much more forage quality in the forage harvested. So I guess to me, there's always this kind of disappointment when you do this intercropping studies. It's like you're expecting that, oh, there's going to be this sort of magic that we're going to put a legume and things are going to be great and we're going to have higher yields and stuff. But it's really hard to find intercropping effects. So really, you always get the question, so does it work? You know, is it, do we have to still invest in this? Well, the first thing is that intercropping is not a thing. Intercropping is like 10 or 15 different things, different variables, right? It's like which species, and from that species, which cultivars or genotypes, how many species, when usually we just focus on just one companion species, but how many species do we need? Which density are we planting that intercrop? Which spatial configuration? Is it all random? Do we have rows? Do we cross them? Do we have 2 rows and another one of the companion crop? When are we planting the legume? Are we planting it all together with the Kernza, or are we planting it the next spring or delaying? Which management we're doing? Are we just managing all for Kernza? Are we managing it with grazing, with more nitrogen or nutrients? When are we harvesting? So there's not one. It's like asking, does applying fertilizer to nitrogen fertilizer work in Kernza? Well, there's so many other things that are there, right? Jake already mentioned the planting date study, and I just wanna, from Corede's master thesis, and I just wanted to use it as an example of that's just one variable in the intercropping. When are you planting the legume, and when are you planting Kernza? And what we found is that if you are intercropping and planting Kernza with the legume in the fall at the same time, the optimal planting date for that it's later than if you are planting Kernza alone in the fall and you're frost seeding the legume the next spring, right? So just that, it's just one example of one variable that's affecting and having very significant effects on the performance of that intercropping, okay? The other thing is we see effects in the first year on the planting date, but we don't see effect the second year of the planting date, right? So there's a temporal component here. How many years have to pass to see different types of effects? Another variable is like, in this case, it's also from Corede's master thesis. We did a variety trial of different, I mean, not variety, but like different breeding populations of Kernza under intercropping. In one experiment with alfalfa, in another experiment with red clover. And we look at the performance of the different populations from Kansas, Minnesota, and Canada on under intercropping. And one of the things is there is, I mean, we didn't have the exact same study without intercropping, so we cannot compare the ranking of intercropping versus no cropping. But one of the things is we see these initial differences in the first year of the different materials, the different populations, and we don't see differences in the second and third year. So they kind of all get to a similar level. Anecdotally, Clearwater didn't do very well in the first year, but it did one of the best third year, no significant differences. The other thing is we compare we group the different breeding programs, Canada, Kansas, Minnesota, and we saw that actually at least in this study under crop, the Kansas populations better yields in Wisconsin than the Minnesota populations in the first year. Both when we looked at harvesting with the combine, when we look at harvesting by hand in quadrats. So there's something there interesting to think about how maybe the breeding programs, maybe I just to discuss with the breeders, the different conditions, the different environments may also affect the performance on the intercropping. And part of this informs what we're doing in the CAP with the G by E by M experiment that was also described. Finally, the experiment that I really wanted to discuss more is this dead intercropping experiment in Arlington and in Sturgeon. And this is a quite large experiment that has two components. One is we compare in 2 planting years, in fall 2006 to 2017, follow it for 3 grain and harvests, where we had 2 row spacings wide and narrow, 57 and 38 centimeters wide, and 10 different systems. And this was Stefania Cartoni's master thesis. The 10 cropping systems we have was a Kernza monoculture unfertilized as a control, a Kernza monoculture with hand weed to move with competition, Kernza monoculture with 40K of nitrogen or 80K of nitrogen, and this was split applied in the spring. And then interseeded with alfalfa, red clover, cura clover, which are perennial legumes, or birch clover and soybean, just for fun, as annual legumes. And the legumes were planted, the Kernza was always planted in the spring, in the fall, and the legumes were planted in the next spring. Of course, these different legumes, different traits, and that's something that, of course, the rooting depth, the height of the plant, all those different traits are going to affect the performance of the intercropping. Now, one of the things, because I think very unique experiment in the sense that we started 2 different years, but we replicated all the same experiment in those 2 different years. A way we can separate the year in the sense of climate year with the age in the sense of how many years Kernza stand had. And so if you look at the blue bars, that's the average of all the experiment yields in Arlington. First year, second year, third year, you see a sort of linear decline from 600 kilograms per hectare, 400 and so, and then to less than 100. But when you look at in the same location, but experiment started the next year, you see a much sharper decline. When we planted in the fall 17, we got 900 kilograms per hectare of yield in 2018 and about 100 in 2019. So that means that it's not, there's an interaction or there's 2 effects here. One is the aging of the stand, and the other one is the particular climate year. For instance, 2019 was a very wet year. There was a lot of rain that may have affected yields in general. And a similar thing can be seen in the other location. So this brings a point, which is when we're doing research on these perennial communities and perennial crops, we really need to, we cannot think like annual crops. We cannot think that, okay, we do it 3 years, the experiment, and we're replicating 3 years, like if you were planting corn 3 years. Here we do it 3 years, but we might be getting the carryover effect of that planting year in the entire life of the stand. What we found with this study, again, no significant differences between the cropping systems in any of the 2 locations in this year, although there was quite variability, and the red clover and alfalfa in the first year in Arlington compete with the Kernza. In the second year, that trend was even more strong. The red clover and the alfalfa and the cura clover, they were all lower yields in Arlington than the other the monocultures. Again, bad news for intercropping, and that can be explained. Biomass, there was really a lot of biomass, a lot of growth of the legumes. Does that mean that intercropping doesn't work or that we cannot do alfalfa or red clover. No, we didn't change density, we didn't change configuration, we didn't change fertility. So there's all the other variables that we also need to manage in order to optimize this system. These are some pictures of the intercrops in the experiment: the red clover with Kernza, the Cura clover, and the alfalfa. Time the communities were dominated by these legumes in our conditions. Another component of this intercropping experiment was in Arlington. We planted in the spring and in the fall the experiment. So Kernza was planted in the spring 17 and in the fall 17, and here we're comparing the question of, does it matter if we plant or in the fall? And again, when we plant in the spring and we planted Kernza and the legume together, we get a lot of competition from the beginning with the legume. If you look at the red clover, alfalfa, even the Cura clover, there were even in the first year very low yielding in terms of grain yield. When we planted in the fall, no differences. The intercrops had no negative effect on the grain yield. So again, this is a very good example of the management matters on response of the intercropping. When we look at the forage biomass, at the above ground biomass for forage, again, when it's planted in the spring versus when it's planted in the fall, we see striking differences, mainly and alfalfa competing with Kernza. And when we planted in the fall, there's not much of an effect of the intercropping. All these graphs show the two row spacings. There wasn't much of an effect on row spacing, except on the control treatment, that the wider row spacing seemed to have a positive effect on the Kernza. This is the same experiment, but now we're looking at the fall forage. And because the spring, the one that was planted in the spring, we have one extra year of forage production, because remember that Kernza has vernalization. So the first year of the spring experiment, really, it's not producing grain. You can see very clearly there that first year, when we had red clover or alfalfa, it grew too much. There wasn't almost any Kernza, and that explains the other yield results we saw. This is the explanation why Carmen came on his Tesla. You're gonna see that. We tried to put some economics into the Kernza, and we work. We're still figuring out those numbers. But when we did the spring planting season, we got a negative effect. The net return is negative when we have the intercropping, basically because the intercropping competed with Kernza and we have very little Kernza yield. When we did the fall planting season, and in this case, we had quite interesting net returns with the Kernza. Of course, this is including the payments for growing Kernza. It's also including the price that's right now. So I think, but when we look at particularly the question, is intercropping more beneficial, because there's a grain, but then you also have the forage quality. Well, when you establish well the Kernza planting in the fall, you get a benefit for the intercropping. You have problems with the establishment because you're doing it in the spring, then the intercropping is negative. Okay, that's kind of the main message here. So just to finish up with some reflections here, I think when we consider intercropping, we have to get past that sense of intercropping is some sort of magic that's going to solve all the problems of Kernza. If this is just a thought experiment, but if we think about grain yield of Kernza over time, we know there's a decline, and we're gonna solve that soon, but right now that's what we have. And when we add nitrogen, we expect that that's higher, and we've seen that in many cases. And then we expect that the legume is gonna provide that nitrogen, but also it's gonna provide, you know, pollinators, and it's gonna provide more water drift and a lot of other things. So when we think, okay, we add the legume, we expect that legume is gonna increase the yields and stop the decline and all that. When actually what we see is something more, more like the green line, where, well, in the first years, there's not a benefit of the intercropping in terms of grain yield, but maybe in the later years, we might see some benefits. And when we're thinking long-term perennial communities, that's where the benefits come. So I guess we have to lower our expectations on the intercropping, but also widen our set of assessment, not just the yield, but look at the forage quality, and look at the pollinators, and look at the soil health, and look at all those other things. And I think that way we might not feel that disappointed whenever we see that, oh, again, alfalfa was competing with Kernza in the first 2 years. I should have talked about all these other studies, but we really don't have analysis yet, but there's really large, cool intercropping studies going on. Number one is a study that has Kernza and different alfalfa cultivars intercropped in rows. And that's the most beautiful study I've seen. I mean, stand of Kernza I've seen is with the alfalfa intercrop. And there's a lot of differences, visual differences between the Kernza and the alfalfa in that study. That's led by Brandon, and it's in Kansas, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Hopefully we'll do the analysis of that sometime soon, and we'll get results. But that's very interesting how different alfalfa varieties affect the Kernza yields and the Kernza biomass. Jake is leading an intercropping study funded through SARE that has in experimental stations in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Kansas, and on farmers' fields, a series of combinations of Kernza intercrops with alfalfa and with other legumes that the farmers decided that were relevant for them. And again, we're in the first year of, well, it's the second year, but the first results we just have from last year. So that is going to be very interesting, and stay tuned for that. And then it was already described the Kernza Cap G by E by M, where we have different Kernza germplasm and different intercrops in different row spacing. So across 6 locations. That's a study that was just established, but it's going to form a lot of this discussion on intercropping too. And then another grant that just started, that's led by Cornell, by Jeannie Moore, is looking the other way. It's like, how can we breed to be a good intercrop for Kernza? And that's a continuation of that first study that Brandon started. But now looking at how can we breed alfalfa to be an optimal companion for Kernza. To sum up, I think intercropping still has a lot of potential. There's a lot more research that's needed, and really we have to be mindful of the number of variables that are associated with the intercropping. When we change intercropping, we're changing the density, we're changing the row spacing, we're changing the management, we're changing a lot of things. And we somehow have to figure out, do studies that can really bring all those variables and help us understand all those differences. Finally, I wanna end with another hopeful thought. These are pictures that my colleague Irina Kravets from the Uman in Ukraine sent me on March 30. They are planting Kernza in Ukraine. And to me, that's a very powerful message of if I was told the world was ending tomorrow, I would still plant my apple tree or whatever. Well, I would still plant my Kernza. So I think this is inspiring to me, and I think it should inspire all of us to keep working on this long term in whatever type of struggle we are. So with that, I want to thank my team. It's all the things that you see are coming from a large, diverse, and committed group of people, and I'm very proud of being part of that. So thank you very much, and I think we might even have some time for questions. So.
Yes, we have time. Any questions? I'll bring the mic to you. Jake. Since I have the mic, I'll also say Wes Jackson, before he left, I think he's not here anymore, said he did the experiment. He walked to the side and he could see the slides better when he was further front. So these empty chairs up here, if you can't see, they're for you.
Thanks, Valentin. I'm really interested in intermediate wheatgrass soybean intercrop and the net revenues. So can you just explain how that works? Was it intermediate wheatgrass planted in the fall and soybeans planted in the spring? And then how and when were the soybeans harvested as like the dual use component?
Yeah, great question, Jake. Thank you. So yeah, the idea, we planted Kernza all in the fall, and in the spring we planted the soybean with the other legumes. But really the treatment of the soybean is that that was the only one that we hoe in between the rows, and we planted all these by hand. These were small plot experiments. Now, soybean grew a little bit, and they was outcompeted by Kernza. We didn't harvest grain or biomass or anything from soybean. There was no. So it's when you look at this result, for instance, in this graph, that the bottom one that says that, you know, it looks like the soybean treatment is the one that had the higher yields. Well, to me, that's just another evidence about the importance of the tillage in the spring, or you know, or some kind of disturbance like Eugene's paper, because to me that's not soybean treatment. That's a hoeing treatment, really, and couldn't harvest any soybean out of it.
Others?
Yeah, Valentin, hi. I was wondering, is there any work about sowing Kernza, like under sowing Kernza with another crop or something?
Can you repeat that again?
Is there any work by you or maybe someone else about sowing Kernza, but under another crop, like
under another crop? Yeah, that's an important thing. We have some farmers who have tried planting Kernza with oats, for instance, in the fall, just as a nurse crop. That then the fall the oat died they didn't harvest anything there. We've had an experiment before that Craig Schaefer in Minnesota, and we had a location looking at the planting at different nurse crops with Kernza. We never were able to get any good conclusion. But again, that was a study that was very early, and we didn't know even how to grow Kernza at all. I think there's a lot of potential for that. I think that has to be explored more, and I'm sure somebody else might have tried something. But I think that planting Kernza with a nurse crop could make the spring planting work, like another cereal that you could harvest, and that first year Kernza is not going to flower anyways, or with a legume or something else. But I don't have results to inform that but I think it's a good thing to research. Yeah.
Thanks, Valentin. It seems like most of the intercrop designs that you're reporting on are experiencing some competition. And I'm wondering your thoughts on mitigating that competition, both in terms of selection of legumes in space, so resource partitioning with much deeper rooted or trying to avoid it. But also in the row spacing, it seems like a lot of these are addition designs as opposed to replacement, where you're removing half of the crop and replacing with a legume. Yeah. But instead, when we're frost seeding or doing things like that, we're adding legumes. And that's adding quite a bit of competition to the mix. So we know that's probably going to happen. Yeah. But in the replacement, you're removing half the crop. So you also would expect a reduction potentially. But just your thoughts on those two kind of axes.
Totally. That's super important, and that's yet another variable that's associated with the intercropping, and that's why we cannot put them all in the same bag. As you were describing, when you plant Kernza in a monoculture, then you plant Kernza with a legume. There's at least 3 different ways of doing that, right? You could maintain the density of Kernza in the field by replacing a row of Kernza, but putting more seeds in that Kernza row. So you are actually increasing the competition within the row of Kernza. You can reduce the density by just keeping the same density in the row, but having half the rows, okay? And that's all confounded in all these different, I mean, not confounded, but like different studies have done different things. I think that one of the things that we really need to do with Kernza, particularly that's related with the yield decline, is we're seeding too much density in the row in general. And we're increasing that when we're doing the intercropping, usually. Okay, we don't need to do that, but we have done it in our studies. And so that's why I say density, and it's an important factor. And I think that's part of what we really need to optimize. Of course, there's the other component, which is the density of the legume. And I think here we're putting a lot of, we were concerned when we planted this experiment that Kernza would outcompete our legumes. And so we put a very high density of the legumes, and that's what we got, a lot of competition from the legume. So managing the density of the legume, it's also important. I do think the timing is super important because you need that initial establishment of Kernza that is not very strong and fast in establishing, and planting the Kernza, the legume later, it gives Kernza that time. But I also think, and as I was reviewing the different previous studies, that we need legumes that are less competitive. White clover, barefoot trefoil, some other legumes that, again, we didn't include them in our studies because we thought that Kernza would outcompete them. But I think we need lower legumes, and I'm not saying alfalfa is bad. I'm just saying I think there's other legumes that could certainly work. And then the other thing, which again, is how do we manage that? I think we cannot expect the legume to contribute anything unless we cut the legume. I mean, it's something that it's obvious, but like the legume doesn't magically fertilize Kernza. The legume fixes nitrogen, and when that legume dies, or when you cut it and releases the biomass from below ground, that's when there's some nitrogen transfer. And so it's never going to contribute anything in the first year unless we cut it. And so figuring out management ways that we can cut the legume without cutting the Kernza or whatever, that's another important thing. But yeah, there's a lot of things to